Welcome, fellow horror hounds, and welcome to the second episode of Talk and Stalk, your unholy home for horror. I'm Barry, this is my corrupted co-host Samuel.
Good evening, folks. Welcome again, indeed, here for our second round. And for all of you who are joining us for the first time, thank you for joining us in our exploration into the infamous titles, the unknown, the unseen, and indeed the obscene.
Now, Samuel, I think our first podcast last week actually went relatively well. You know, it's the first time we've ever actually done a podcast together. It's all pretty new to us, but it was actually brought to my attention that we actually had some audio problems that we were unaware of. Until after we'd actually recorded it. We don't actually know what caused the problem, but we do wholeheartedly apologise to the listeners out there, and we're going to try our best to make sure it doesn't actually happen again.
The flip side being, though, is that we are very thankful to the listeners for flagging up this issue because, of course, what we want is the best for you.
Yeah, that's it. Because I believe it was really kind of your side, wasn't it? We were getting quite an echo on a lot of when you were talking, but as I say, we've not actually found the root of the problem. We think that the volume might have been too loud, so we've actually put it down. But yeah, we'll get the ball rolling anyway. Today's topic of discussion is going to be on what is one of my favourite subgenres within the realm of horror, and that is the slasher genre. Now, for me, the golden age of slashers, it really all kind of started with Halloween in 1978, but the golden age was very much, I think, from 78 to kind of the mid-80s. You could possibly say late 80s, when slasher films were being churned out left, right and centre. I mean, in 81 alone, there were at least 10 slasher films that I can think of. There was certainly a saturation of slasher movies within this period. The films that we're actually going to be concentrating on today are the non-franchised slasher films, the standalone slasher films that never had sequels. So, no Nightmare on Elm Streets, no Halloweens, no Friday the 13th. Some of these films have actually had remakes. We're counting them. Also, I could preface this by saying I don't necessarily think that these are some of the best horror films or necessarily some of the best slasher films around. I think some of them are, but they're our personal favourites. It was quite a hard list to condense because there were so many slasher films coming out within this time. So it's kind of, we're going from 1978 really up until kind of the mid to late 80s. So I know that Samuel, you're quite a slasher fan yourself, aren't you?
Well, I'd say I've got the few that I have a fascination with. I'm massively in love with. I do not share the same level of encyclopedia-like knowledge as you do on the slasher genre, I'm afraid. However, no, it's a genre that keeps on giving, I say.
Yeah. Okay, well, we're gonna get the ball rolling. Basically, I've picked 5 films. Samuel's picked 5 films. Admittedly, there's one film on Samuel's list that I would actually have on my list, but being the gentleman that I am, I let Samuel have it. That was certainly my good deed for the day. So we'll get the ball rolling now. In the number 5 spot for me is The Prowler. Released in 81, as I say, a very busy year for slasher films. We had Halloween 2, Friday the 13th 2 come out that year, among many others. I'm not going to go into the names because there might actually be some of them names on this list. The Prowler, otherwise known as Rosemary's Killer in America. I think it actually boasts some of Tom Savini's best work within the slasher genre. It actually has some cool kills. A pretty creepy looking killer. Creepy, albeit cool looking killer. I think the film does have some pacing issues, certainly in the middle act, the middle portion of the movie, which really kind of hinders the film somewhat and actually stops it from being a great slasher film. But overall, it's got good deaths, creepy killer. It was directed by Joseph Zito, who actually went on to direct Friday the 13th Part 4. which is widely regarded by many Friday the 13th fans to be one of the best, if not arguably the best in the franchise. Farley Granger's in there, a very established actor who actually starred in two Alfred Hitchcock films, Strangers on a Train and Rope, which I think is one of Hitchcock's more underrated films. But yeah, I think The Prowler is a pretty overlooked slasher film. Have you seen it, Samuel?
A long time ago, I remember a colleague of mine actually writing about it in one of their papers. However, it's one I've been needing to revisit, so I'll take your word for it into giving it a rewatch.
Yeah, it's definitely. I mean, it's kind of worth watching, really, for the death scenes. Courtesy of Tom Savini alone. Who did some great work. As you know, Tom Savini is one of the biggest names out there for horror SFX. What's the film on your number 5 spot?
Another film that came out in 1981. It is My Bloody Valentine. Its original title was The Secret. Yeah, so not necessarily the most engaging of titles. So no. My Bloody Valentine is much more relevant.
Yeah.
Because it involves Valentine's Day, and it is quite a bloody one, actually. It's one of those where it got butchered by the Motion Picture Association of America. So when it was first came out, audiences it was a bit of a lackluster. But as time has gone on, people have become more appreciative of it, and it's considered one of the better, more underrated examples of the slasher genre. And for all of you collectors, there is a director's cut with an additional 3 extra minutes of footage. So the standard retail version is like 90 minutes. There's a 93-minute version for all of you out there. It has some very satisfying murders with the pickaxe, rather well executed, I say. There's one bit right up into the chin, the jaw, if you like, which, that caused a reaction and a half. I wonder if Edgar Wright stole that for that scene in Hot Fuzz.
Yeah, I think you're right. For the listeners and that, My Bloody Valentine was going to be the film that just kind of missed out on my top 5. I think it is one of the best slasher films of the era. I think it has a pretty high body count, gore aplenty. Certainly, if you've seen the as Samuel said, the extended cut, which was only released up until a few years ago. But a cool looking killer. I think the mine actually makes a suitably creepy setting for that film as well. I actually thought the 2009 remake actually wasn't too bad either. As modern horror movie remakes go, I thought it was okay. What did you think to that, Samuel? Have you seen the remake?
Oh, it was absolute dumb fun in a way that it was enjoyable. It wasn't trying to be too serious with itself. It knew exactly how daft it was, and it just had so much fun with it. I actually own a copy of it. I don't regret that. It doesn't have the same impact, but oh my goodness,
yeah, I think
so much fun. I mean,
little known fact though, isn't it, that I'm not sure if you know, but Quentin Tarantino's favourite slasher film is My Bloody Valentine. That's his favourite.
Do you know what? I was going to make reference to that. However, I didn't double check my sources, so I wasn't going to say that with confidence. So I'm glad you could confirm that.
Okay, number 4. Now, this is one of the more obscure slasher films. This is a slasher film that a lot of people don't talk about. It doesn't really get much attention, but it has attained kind of a very small cult status over the years. It was released in early 83, actually started production in 1980. This film spent 3 years in production. And it's called Curtains. This film actually went through a lot of reshoots, numerous rewrites, and I actually think it's a pretty good little slasher flick. Again, it was critically slated upon release. It was a film that it didn't do well, but like I say, it has amassed a little bit of a cult following. I like the atmosphere of the movie. I like the fact that its emphasis is on suspense. It's a pretty low body count. There's barely anything in terms of gore in this movie. But it stars a very established actor, John Vernon. who over 200 acting credits to his name. This is the guy that's been in Dirty Harry, National Lampoon's Animal House, most notably my personal favourite role, Captain Mooney in Killer Clowns from Outer Space. I love his character in that film. I think he also went on to voice Rupert Thorne, crime mobster in the Batman the Animated Series. But you've got Samantha Egger in there as well, an established actress, and Lynn Griffin, who actually had a very small role in the 1974 Black Christmas. She was actually the first victim of the film, but she's actually got a much larger role in this. What I like about Curtains, I like the sense of claustrophobia, I like the atmosphere. Has a creepy mask. I think the killer's mask is pretty creepy in this film. And there's actually a doll in it. I won't go into details in case in case there's people that haven't seen it, but there's a creepy little doll in this movie as well. I don't think it's one of the best slasher films ever made, but I definitely think it's a slasher film that more people need to watch. I don't think you're aware of this one, are you, Samuel?
No, this is where your specialty certainly shines through.
It's ironic, really, because the director, by the way, actually left the movie and detached his name from the film. Because of all the bad publicity the film received. And the director in the film, played by John Vernon, Jonathan Stryker, I believe his name is the name that they used on the credits for the director. They used the fictional director's name for the credits. I've never known a film to do that before or since. To just have a made-up name as the director. But, yeah. Okay, what's the number 4 on your list, Samuel?
A similar sort of vibe where I wouldn't consider it one of the greatest slasher films, however, it's a guilty pleasure of mine. Released in 1978, I think it was made then, but they released in 79, The Toolbox Murders. Now, I mean, it's one of those. It tried to cash in on the selling point of the tool of the power tool, like from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but it wasn't overly that successful at first. But it was one of those that developed a following. But it did inspire later films like Abel Ferrara's The Driller Killer, as well as The Nail Gun Massacre. It also gained further notoriety because it became one of the video nasties in Britain in the early 80s, but it ended up being dropped eventually because, well, aside from the first 40 minutes, it's not necessarily overly that violent, but the scenes of murder are actually relatively satisfying if that is very much your cup of tea of seeing women being screaming about and such.
If you're a sadist, in other words.
That's one way to put it. One of the reasons I put this in the list is because, well, the first 40 minutes absolutely shoot by with the murders, but the murderers' motivations are closer to the motives of the killer in What Have You Done to Solange, as opposed to, say, Friday the 13th. Now, of course, I mentioned What Have You Done to Solange because the giallo genre, as well as the slasher genre, they both have some similarities. There are major distinctions, but there are similarities. And I think it's that motivation that the killer has in this film, which made me go, I kind of like that.
Yeah. I think it's a film I need to rewatch. I have not seen this film for a long time. I remember it starring Cameron Mitchell, who stars in probably my favourite Mario Bava film, Blood and Black Lace, in '64. It's definitely a film I need to rewatch. I'm not sure if you've seen the remake. I thought the remake was okay. I didn't think the remake was that bad.
I think it was darker in tone. I think with the original, you could at least poke some fun at some of the acting and some of the tone.
Yeah.
Whereas it's a lot more straight-laced in the Tobe Hooper film, which is actually worth pointing out, being directed by Tobe Hooper.
Yeah.
So it's better executed, it's better made, but whether or not that makes it any more enjoyable, that's subjective.
Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, these films, slasher films, I mean, you can never expect top-class art, certainly from this time period. You can't expect top-class acting or an Oscar-winning script or anything like that. These films are there to present, give us an easy watch, if you will. As long as, slasher films are renowned for, as long as the kills are good, the suspense is good, pretty much kind of the ingredients you need, isn't it, for these kind of films?
Yeah, that sounds about right, really. Although, I mean, the element of misogyny that's prevalent in the vast majority of slasher films, I think, needless to say, makes them a little bit problematic. However, that's something else.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I'll quickly get on to the next one. But yeah, quickly before that is that I actually did read some statistics a while back, and in the slasher genre, believe it or not, more men have been killed than women. More men.
That's fascinating.
There are. They actually outnumber, shockingly. But there seems to be this huge misconception that the majority of slasher victims are actually females. There's not a lot in it. It's something like... I mean, bearing in mind, I don't know how they if they served every single slasher film that had ever come out or anything, but it was something like 60-40. It was like 60% men, 40% women. But anyway, that'll be for another podcast when we get into the whole politics of it. The next film on the list is a slasher film that probably needs no introduction to slasher fans out there, and that's The Burning. Released in 1981, again, that year again. Came out the year. It's another campsite slasher film, very much following in the footsteps of Friday the 13th. It came out the year after Friday the 13th. One of the earliest video nasties in the UK. Bob Weinstein's first film as producer. Less said about that man, the better. But yeah, that was actually his first film that put him on the map. It, again, like The Prowler, Rosemary's Killer, I think it actually boasts some of Savini's best work in the slasher genre. There's some great kills. There's one scene in particular, I won't say what in case people haven't seen the movie, but there is one scene in particular that's very notable, that is very often talked about among slasher fans. And I think it's interesting that this is the film that Savini took on and passed up Friday the 13th Part 2 for. He did the effects for Friday the 13th, which were great, and actually passed up the sequel to do The Burning instead. There's quite a few stars in this film. There's Jason Alexander, who obviously achieved stardom with Seinfeld. Holly Hunter, kind of a blink and you'll miss it role. It's kind of a little more than a glorified cameo, but Holly Hunter's very first film. I think it's a film that probably has some pacing issues at times. But when the kills happen, they're great. I actually think the film has a good killer in Cropsey, and quite uniquely for this film as well. There's not many slasher films that do this. The final girl, as it's often been known, in this film is actually a man. It's actually a guy. And you don't find that often in slasher movies. But the lead character, or certainly towards the last act of the movie, is actually a male. So I think The Burning is, again, I think it's one of the best slasher films of kind of that time period. What's your thoughts on it, Samuel?
I think Tom Savini did a terrific job, but then again, the man's was effortless with the special effects he did. I think you meant to say Harvey Weinstein in terms of producing, but as you say,
I said Bob.
Less the better. Yeah, but Bob, I think it's as much of a problem.
Harvey, sorry, yeah.
It's with the Nasties though, it had a very complicated history because it had very few scenes snipped. The uncut version was accidentally released, and it was found the censored version was found guilty of obscenity in Peterborough. So there's a weird element. There's a grey area with whether or not you can probably classify as a video nasty. All in all, though, despite some, I guess you could say, a tainted aura with it, if you can remove that, it is definitely one of the more entertaining slasher films, I would say.
Yeah. Definitely. What's the next film on your list? What's your number 3 pick?
Released in 1981 in Spain, and made in West Germany and Spain, Bloody Moon, directed by everyone's favorite perverted filmmaker, Jess Franco. He's a very unique one. I mean, the man specializes in erotica, but the thing is, his films aren't actually erotic or really sexy. This is the weird thing about it. I really like Female Vampire, and I really like She Killed in Ecstasy. I really didn't like Oasis of the Zombies, and I really don't like Women in Cell Block 9. With this, though, I mean, it's it's unusual, really, to have a Jess Franco film to actually feature sort of this sort of violence. I mean, you have the amazing scene with the buzzsaw. Well, it's not necessarily buzzsaw, but is it a male saw, if you like? Absolutely satisfying. And there's a bit where a woman gets stabbed in the back and it comes out through her chest. That was a particular red flag for censorship. However, I just for something different, actually, Bloody Moon is actually, I'd say, not one of Franco's best films, but it's certainly one of his more watchable films, if you could really say that.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's a sleazy movie. I've got it on Blu-ray. I quite like it. It's kind of a giallo-esque almost as well. It's kind of slasher part giallo. There's a few other films that kind of fall into that category. I think that's for a later podcast though. There's quite a few films out there within that time period. Blade in Dark. Blade in the Dark, directed by Lamberto Bava, that kind of falls into that category. It's kind of part giallo, part slasher. But yeah, I agree with you on Bloody Moon. I don't think it's necessarily his best film, but it's, yeah, certainly for the time period. I think it's it certainly provides it does what it kind of sets out to do. So we're on to number 2 pick now. Now, this is a controversial choice. This is a very controversial pick because there are people out there that don't deem this to be a slasher film. But personally, I think it's very much in the mould of a slasher film. And that is April Fool's Day, released in 86. So it's kind of one of the later 80s slasher films, if you'll call it that. I think April Fool's Day is a really good slasher film, directed by Fred Walton, who actually directed the original When a Stranger Calls in 1979. I like its very kind of Agatha Christie-esque vibe. There's definitely echoes of Agatha Christie's classic And Then There Were None. The setting, obviously, there's no blood or anything like that. I can't really talk about the ending because, obviously, in case there are people that haven't seen it, the ending is very divisive. Some people love the ending, some people really don't. I actually love the ending. The reason I love the ending is because it's the ending to me that makes this film stand out from so many other slasher films. It's what kind of makes it unique. So I can understand why some people don't categorize it as a slasher movie, but to me, it has the whole mold. It has the mold and formula of one. You've got a great little final girl in Amy Steele, who was also the final girl in Friday the 13th Part 2. There is actually a remake that came out in 2008. I haven't actually seen it. I don't think I really intend on seeing it, but April Fool's Day. I think it's one that some people love it, some people really don't. But for me, and it's by Paramount as well, so it was kind of big studio backing it. The score, I think the film's got a great score by Charles Bernstein, who actually did, I thought, one of his best works for Nightmare on Elm Street, which had a really good score. What's your thoughts on April Fool's Day, Samuel, if you've seen it?
Unfortunately, I haven't seen it, so I haven't got much to contribute. All I'll say is this. It's one of those where I think the more you think on the title, it's expansive, if you like.
It gives it away. In a way, it kind of gives it away. But I think it's a well put together slasher film. It's from the same studio that gave us My Bloody Valentine and Friday the 13th, and I think Paramount churned out some good ones. But yeah, so what's your number 2 pick, Samuel?
Right, number 2, released in 1982. It's another Spanish film that, to quote Peter Normanton, who did a book called The Mammoth Book of Slasher Movies, he describes it as a film that's been regarded as a piece of Euro trash produced to cash in on the American slasher market, called Pieces. Yeah. Now, it's an absolute mess. The story is almost nonsensical, and it borrows so much. You can't even say borrows; it steals so much
Yeah.
in terms of the motivations of the killer. The motivations of the killer are reminiscent of Psycho. The murder weapon is predominantly Texas Chainsaw Massacre. There's one bit that actually even borrows the house by the cemetery. Lucio Fulci. However, yeah, it shoots at a decent pace, and the murders themselves are really, really satisfying. It had, needless to say, it had some issues with censorship as well. It had a beautiful, beautiful release by Grindhouse Releasing some years back. It's not necessarily a conventional one. The whodunit element, I think, is better done in this one than some of your more generic American slasher films. However, it's the dubbing is absolutely terrible, so I think you kind of have to watch it in its original or native language. All in all, though, the death scenes, the murders themselves are pretty damn satisfying. It's one that's made me revisit it more than others.
Yeah, I've seen pieces. I was actually tempted in picking it up recently on Blu-ray. I'm not a big fan of it. It's certainly not one of my favourites, but I do enjoy it. It's like you said, it is a mess, but it's kind of a guilty pleasure. As you say, chainsaw. Yep, there's a lot of splatter in there. There's a lot of gore in there, and it does rip off earlier and better films and whatnot. But it's definitely one of them. And like you say, it's Spanish, isn't it? It's a Spanish movie.
That's right. In fact, I think he was. I may have got this other way around. He may have been Jess Franco's successor, or the sort of Jess Franco actually would become his sort of successor, being one of the more prolific filmmakers as in Spain, who of course did Bloody Moon, as we've mentioned.
Yeah, it's definitely. I will have to pick it up. It's been quite some time actually since I've seen it. I remember the chainsaw, and I remember the killer, black clad, yeah. Okay, on to the number one spot. Now, this was released in 1980. It was directed by Roger Spottiswoode, who actually would go on to direct, much bigger films like Turner and Hooch and Pierce Brosnan's second Bond film, Tomorrow Never Dies. Terra Train, starring the one and only Jamie Lee Curtis. Terra Train came out, it was I think a year and a half after Halloween, and I think with this film, Halloween is the movie that undoubtedly made Jamie Lee Curtis a star, but I think she'd really kind of cemented her role as a scream queen with this film. Jamie Lee Curtis had been in 4 horror movies, all within the space of 2 years. Halloween, The Fog, Prom Night, and then Terra Train. What I like about Terra Train is the very claustrophobic aspect. I love the setting. I think the setting is perfect. Actually filmed on a real train. I like the fact that its emphasis is on suspense. It's a pretty low body count. There's little in the way of gore. It's like I say, more about suspense. And I like the fact that it's a fancy dress party on a train, that the killer actually kind of remains quite cleverly hidden from the audience. So even though we suspect we might know who the killer is, we don't actually get to see the killer properly, because the killer is actually moving from costume to costume on the train. It stars an established actor in Ben Johnson. Hell of a career that man had prior to this film. I think this might have been his last movie, actually. I think this was his last film. Even Hart Bochner, excuse me if I'm pronouncing that wrong, who actually starred in a slasher film many years later. He was in Urban Legends Final Cut. But yeah, what I like I think Terra Train actually has a tagline that I really like as well. The boys and girls are Sigma Phi, some will live, some will die. That's always kind of stuck with me, that tagline. And, the poster of the Groucho Marx wearing killer, and which is, it's clearly is holding a knife. It's kind of a rip-off of Psycho and that. Sorry, not Psycho, Halloween. But I think Terra Train's a good slasher flick. It has amassed a bit of a cult following, obviously, over the years, and that among slasher fans, it is a pretty popular film now. But among the mainstream, it's not a very well-known horror movie, and It's my favourite. It's my favourite non-franchise slasher from that era. So, yeah, you haven't seen Terra Train, have you, Samuel?
No, unfortunately, it's the guilty one. The thing is that I can see your face light up when you talk about it, though. The enthusiasm is right there.
Oh, yeah, I'm practically salivating almost, aren't I? There was going to be a remake. The remake got scrapped, and it ended up becoming Train instead, starring Thora Birch, which was essentially kind of little more than Hostel on a train. But I recommend it. So, all right, down to the big drum roll here. What's your number one pick, Samuel?
Well, I actually feel like I'd be more enthusiastic about this one because I feel I actually can have more to contribute about this particular title. Made in 1980, starring Joe Spinell and Carolyn Monroe, Maniac, directed by William Lustig. So Carolyn Monroe, everyone will know from The Spy Who Loved Me. Joe Spinell had some small but significant roles in the likes of Taxi Driver and Rocky. I believe that's the case. Tom Savini did some amazing special effects for this film. It's another one that borrows the elements of mummy issues, if you like, from Psycho. But the killer, Frank Zitz, is stalking New York City, cutting up women, if you like, scalping them and making trophies out of them. There's one particular murder scene which struck a nerve with a lot of people. I think we've seen them talking about the car shooting.
I do, yeah.
Yeah, so the film critic Gene Siskel, who would do shows alongside Roger Ebert, claimed that he walked out of that scene because of how vile it was. And it struck a nerve with New Yorkers because of its reminiscence to the murders committed by the son of Sam only just a few years beforehand. However, in terms of low-budget guerrilla filmmaking, it did an absolutely amazing job. There was supposed to be a sequel called Maniac to Mr. Robbie. However, unfortunately, by the time the script was done and it had been pitched, the slasher genre had sort of essentially died down. However, William Lustig developed himself a decent career afterwards. He would go on to direct Maniac Cop, for which horror icon Bruce Campbell would have a role in as well. We'd have ourselves Uncle Sam, released in 1997, and he would eventually start up... what was it called? Blue Underground.
Yeah. He's he basically went on to bigger and better things. I think with Maniac's not a film. It's not a film that I particularly like, but it's like you said, the film definitely has that grit and that sleaze, and Joe Spinell just does a fantastic job of playing sleazy, doesn't he?
Oh, it's very, absolutely very unnerving. He did it. Weirdly enough, both him and Carolyn Monroe would do another horror film called The Last Horror Film, which in itself is kind of like the horror equivalent to The King of Comedy. This, egotistical individual with delusions of grandeur who puts this individual on a pedestal, tries to get them involved into, creating this career out of them. So that's an interesting one, but that isn't necessarily a slasher film per se. Maniac, though, was the film that captured my interest in terms of, the slasher genre as well as censorship. Yeah. So again, it's not an easy film to watch. However, if you are unscrupulous, depraved, then it's a real cup of tea, really.
Helps, yeah. I think with Maniac, I felt like I needed a shower whilst watching it. I felt dirty. It's like you said though, it boasts some great work by Savini again, particularly the car shooting scene is a definite highlight of that movie, and I think it must be noted that the remake was good. I did like the remake.
Well, considering who's behind it, Alexandra Aja, who of course did Switchblade Romance, so I think it was in capable hands, and I think it still has the nastiness, but it's just better made in some way. No, it's just, it looks better. So whether or not that's a selling point, or whether or not they'll put you off of it, that's that's going to be subjective. On a final note, the comic distributor in America called Ibon Press. They did this amazing sort of adaptation of of Maniac, but they also did a crossover with the New York Ripper.
Another film that made me feel dirty.
Oh, it's a
Directed
vile
by
one.
Lucio Fulci. It's a pretty tough watch. That film just screams sleaze. Yeah, New York Ripper. That's a film that I'd recommend to all of you gorehounds, exploitation fans out there.
Or just outright misogynists.
Yeah. I don't know if we're going to get many people holding their hand up and admitting that though. But yeah. So I think that concludes the episode for today. Thanks to everyone for listening, and we'll be back soon enough for the third part. And yeah, take care, and we'll see you again soon.
Yes, once again, thank you very much, and always be sure to lock your doors and keep an eye out. Don't fall asleep.
Okay, and on that note, adios for now.